Now, the very next thing you come to is we skip forward a number of years. We skip forward to about 539 BC. We skip forward to the time of the fall of Babylon. Now, we find that as we pick up the story with Belshazzar, Belshazzar is evidently the king's grandson. Belshazzar's mother was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. His father, Nabonidus. You know, it's interesting, the critics, of course, want to dismiss Daniel. The problem they have with Daniel is that, you know, if you accept the book of Daniel, then what you find is there's a real God that can declare the future in advance. And so for a long time they pointed out what they said were inaccuracies. They said Daniel is just sort of a romance written many years later. Well, there was no Belshazzar, and Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. Well, of course, you know, eventually archaeology caught up to them, and they found out, yes, there was a Belshazzar. Belshazzar was the co-ruler. Nabonidus was indeed the king, but Nabonidus had elevated Belshazzar to the throne as his co-ruler, and Nabonidus was elsewhere in the empire with an army, and Belshazzar was actually the one presiding in Babylon. And if they had read carefully Daniel 5 to begin with, they would have understood that, because what was the promise that Belshazzar made to Daniel? Remember, he said, whoever interprets this dream, or this vision, or this great event, he promised him that he would make him the third ruler of the kingdom. That's that was the promise that he made. That when Daniel was brought in, that he said, the end of verse 16, you'll be the third ruler in the kingdom. Well, why would you promise him the third ruler? Well, because he himself was only the second ruler. Anyway, the answer was actually right in the text if the critics had bothered to look, but they waited until the story came out from archaeology. Now, what you find is Babylon was under siege. Cyrus had put a siege army there, but the Babylonians were so filled with pride that Belshazzar, after this siege has gone on for weeks and weeks and weeks, is actually holding a celebration to celebrate the invincibility of Babylon. Nothing can conquer us. You see, Babylon had walls that were so huge that you couldn't begin to break them down. The Euphrates River flowed under Babylon, so they had an unlimited source of water. The area that was encompassed within the city walls was so vast, they had so much food stored up, they could outlast any siege. You couldn't break it down, and you couldn't starve them out. What were you going to do? Sooner or later, the army of Nabonidus will get back and deliver us. So he has this party, which very quickly degenerates into a drinking bout, and they're drinking wine to the gods of. As we're told in verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. And I suspect by the time they got down to drinking toast to the gods of wood and stone, they were pretty well sloshed. They were drinking to this god and that god, and after Belshazzar had gotten himself fortified a little bit, he decided to bring in the golden and silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Boy, he really had gotten courageous now after a little while. He's going to show, his greatness. And so they start doing this. And about the time they get started good using the vessels from the temple, the sacred vessels, all of a sudden a man's hand just appeared out of nowhere and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall. And the king saw, it was, I'm sure he was sitting up on the platform there, the head table, and everybody else is sitting out there, and they're all drinking. It's right in his line of vision, just where he's looking. All of a sudden his hand just appears up there and starts writing. Well, The king's countenance was changed, verse 6. His thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. That's, I think, an interesting expression. The joints of his loins were loosed is an old King James expression, sort of a euphemism for sort of embarrassing accident that the king had about this point. He was absolutely scared to death. And, his knees are knocking. He just, I bet you had instant silence in that place. Here everybody's laughing and talking and carrying on and boozing it up. And the next thing you know, they're all scared to death. And the king wants somebody to come in and interpret what this means. But they couldn't do that. And he was really troubled. And the queen, evidently the queen mother, she heard all the commotion, came in, and she said, look, verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, your ancestor, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods was found in him. And Nebuchadnezzar had made him master of the magicians and astrologers. He'll be able to interpret it. His name is Daniel. So one of the things you get the idea, Daniel rose to great prominence in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, but evidently Daniel hasn't been, his services haven't been needed for a while in the aftermath of Nebuchadnezzar's service, and he's sort of been retired or put down, put aside somewhere. But the Queen Mother comes in and she says, I remember a man that used to serve in the court of your grandfather, and he's the one you need. So they bring Daniel in. And the king starts making all these big promises as to what he's going to do, and make him third ruler of the kingdom. Daniel tells him, verse 17, you keep your gifts, and I'll make known what the writing is. And he said, listen, the Most High God, verse 18, gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, your ancestor, a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty he gave him, all people and nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive. Whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. When his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne. He was driven from the sons of men. Until, verse 21, he knew that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and that he appoints over it whomsoever he will. And you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. I think that's interesting. See, Belshazzar had heard the story. May have been old enough to have at least remembered it as a child. He'd heard the story. He was familiar with what happened. But he said, you knew all this, and you haven't humbled yourself. You've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You've brought vessels from the temple. You showed utter contempt toward the true God, the God in whose hand your breath is, and whose are all your ways, have you not glorified. So he said, this is what the writing is, and he read it, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, and then he interprets it. Now let's understand these. What was the problem with this? The script that the Hebrews and the Chaldeans wrote in was the same. What we call Hebrew script today is the square Babylonian script that was used in Babylon. The words were not unknown, but they made no sense. They were written up there, mene or mina, tekel or shekel. They're different forms of the same word. You is the conjunction in Hebrew. It means and. That's why when it interprets it later on down, it refers to it as Perez. You Farson or you Pharez and Perez. So these are units of, these are weights that are measures. They're numbers. The mina, the shekel, and the Perez. Now, he said, mene, this is a number. The significance of it is God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. That's a weight. See, you're weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, this is the the smallest of these here. Your kingdom is divided, given to the Medes and the Persians. You know, it's like if you saw something written on the wall and it said pounds, pounds, tons, and ounces. You know what the word is, but it doesn't mean anything. I mean, if you see some mysterious thing like that written on the wall, it's even though you might be able to pronounce the word, it's meaningless in that context. And that was the problem. You know, these words are strange to us. They weren't strange to someone who spoke Chaldean or Aramaic or Hebrew. Now, we find that that very night, the kingdom fell to the Medes, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom. He was 62. He was actually Cyrus's general, and Cyrus, at the point where he knew the city was going to be taken, took a portion of the army and went on elsewhere to meet Nabonidus, his army, and Darius is the one who entered. You see, how could Babylon fall? Well, very simple. What Belshazzar didn't know while he was doing all his celebrating is the armies of Cyrus had been for weeks digging a diversionary canal. That night when the sun went down, they broke the dike that was left, and when they did, the water in the channel went through, you know, the diversionary canal, and very quickly then the water level dropped under Babylon, under the walls of Babylon, and they let it drop on down until it got about knee-high. Sent some soldiers underneath the city wall, just marching through the mud, came up on the other side while everybody's having a party, opened the gates from the inside, and next thing you know, the army had come in and just took them all by surprise. Now let me show you something. As we look at chapters 4 and 5, we notice a connection. You know, in chapter 4, the tree is cut down and 7 times pass over Nebuchadnezzar. That story is retold briefly in Daniel chapter 5, and this time we find these weights that are measures that are written there on the wall. Now, it is sort of interesting as you you know, as you go through and begin to add them up, because you find when you look at the 7 times. Now, what is 7 times? Well, we know that a time times and half a time is equated with 42 months, or 1,260 days, right? 7 times is twice that much. See, 42 months is 3.5 years. 3 years is 36 months, and 6 more makes 42. 1,260 days, time times and a half a time, 42 months are all equated with one another. Double that, 7 times would then equal 2,520 days. Now, just keep that in remembrance, and you find then when you look at the Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, that the phrase comes out here that there were 50 minas to the shekel, and 25 perez to the shekel. Well, how many shekels do we have here? Well, a mina's 50, and another mina is another 50. That's 100. The shekel itself is just 1, so that's 101. You add in the perez, which is 25 shekels, and you come up to 126 shekels. Well, what does 126 shekels amount to? Well, let me show you something else. If you go back to the end of Leviticus chapter 27, verse 25, all your estimation shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary. 20 gerahs shall be the shekel. Well, we see that we have a list of 120, that we have a total of 126 shekels here. They're all weights that are numbers, and if you divide them down to their smallest amount, well, it's 126 shekels, but we find that there's a smaller measurement. There are 20 gerahs to the shekel. So if you got 126 shekels and you multiply it by 20 gerahs, how many gerahs do you have? 2,520. Now, that's sort of interesting. When you look at the 7 times Nebuchadnezzar, and you look at the handwriting on the wall for Belshazzar, and the two incidents, remember, are connected. Daniel recounts for him the story and says, you should have learned the lesson your grandfather learned. It's interesting. You see, it's on sort of two levels. On one, in a literal sense, it was fulfilled in Nebuchadnezzar's lifetime. When was the tree of Babylon cut down? Well, it was cut down that night. It was cut down that night. 539 BC. Fall of 539. Come forward 2,520 years. What happens? Well, if you come forward 2,520 years, that brings you to the fall of 1982. Now, remember, the stump was banded until that time. There were bands of brass and iron, just like we're going to see the significance of that. But now, here in the fall of 1982, very interesting series of events began in the fall of 1982. On the evening that began the Feast of Trumpets in 1982, there was a no-confidence vote in the German Bundestag that ended the tenure of the Social Democrats that had been ruling Germany. Their policy was very much an accommodation with the Russians and an acceptance of the permanent division of Europe. And they were interested in conciliating the Russians. When the vote of no confidence was taken on the evening that began the Feast of Trumpets, 2 weeks later, on the evening that began the Feast of Tabernacles in 1982, a new government was sworn in, the Christian Democrats, which was the official Roman Catholic political party of Germany, started by the Pope in the aftermath of World War II, funded by the Vatican. In Italy and Germany, when the Nazis and the fascists left, the Vatican reorganized, after they were defeated, reorganized the Christian Democrats in both of those countries, which tended then to dominate the thing. They were funded by Vatican money. That was where the Christian in the name comes from. We think in terms of separation in church and state in America in a different way than they do in Europe. Well, they came to power, and there began a series of events that was very much aimed at doing something else in Europe. And exactly 7 years, exactly 7 literal times later, in the fall of 1989, is when the Berlin Wall was breached and when the communist governments of Eastern Europe fell like dominoes, and within a matter of weeks, the Iron Curtain was no more. Germany was now to be reunited, and these remarkable events that have taken place that have taken place since then. So I think we have an interesting pattern. That's basically when the iron bands were cut and the stump began to revive. Interestingly enough, the Pope gave a speech that fall of 1982 at a Catholic shrine in Spain, where that was the speech in which he called upon Europe to unite from the Atlantic to the Urals, to rediscover your roots. Well, remember what Nebuchadnezzar was told, the stump will be left in the ground, the roots will be left intact, but the tree's going to be cut down. He told Europe to rediscover their roots. What were their roots? Well, you read about them right here in Daniel 4, if you really want the roots. That's why it's called Babylon the Great. It is a revival, ultimately, of ancient Babylon in a way that is different than the predecessors. Now, at this point, the Persians have taken Babylon. Darius of course, organizes things. Daniel, who's been sort of in semi-retirement, now gets advanced. Word must have traveled pretty quickly, and by the time the Persians have taken over, they've heard the story of the handwriting on the wall and Daniel, and so Daniel is given a very high position under Darius, and this produces a little bit of jealousy. And, they couldn't find occasion against Daniel. They couldn't say that he was incompetent, because he was really on top of things, very capable. Couldn't say he was dishonest, because he wasn't. What are you going to accuse him of? Well, you remember the story. They came up with this crazy idea. They came to Darius and they said, look, they said, you're the new king here, and people need to know how great you are and that the gods dwell in you. You ought to make a decree that nobody can pray to any god for the next 30 days except you. That'll really get everybody looking to you. Well, Darius signs this decree, and the Medes and the Persians had a particular custom, and that was what was called the law of the Medes and the Persians. Once it was said, couldn't be changed, couldn't be reversed. Because if you reverse it, then you're admitting the king made a mistake. The king doesn't make mistakes. So this was the theory behind it. Well, Daniel, when he knew the writing was signed, Daniel didn't change his practice at all. He went to his house, his windows were open toward Jerusalem, and he knelt down and he prayed 3 times a day, just like he always did. Well, these guys were sneaking around. They were waiting, and as soon as they caught Daniel praying, well, they ran over and told the king and said, hey, haven't you signed this decree? Well, guess what? Daniel the Jew, he's praying to another god. He doesn't regard you or your decrees or your gods. Well, the king, verse 14, when he heard these words, he was sore displeased with himself. At this point, he realizes how stupid he was. And he also, at this point, see, his vanity's been played on. Now he realizes, I was really set up. The one guy I could depend on was Daniel. These fellows are jealous of him. Now they're trying to get him in trouble. So the king tries to figure a way to get Daniel out of trouble. He labors till the going down of the sun, trying to keep figuring a way and getting more advisors and more lawyers in on the mix. But the bottom line of it was, look, it's the law of the Medes and the Persians. Can't be changed. So the king commanded, and they brought Daniel, and they cast him into the lion's den. And the king spoke to Daniel, and he said, your God, whom you serve, will deliver you. He brought a stone, sealed the mouth of the den, and then sealed it with his own signet. In other words, they put, some sort of wax or something around the part of the edge, and he sealed it to where you could prove that it hadn't been broken. The seal wasn't broken. So he sealed it, and his lords they put their signet on it. So he went back to his palace, and he didn't eat that night. And he didn't, take part in the entertainment, didn't allow the music to be brought in. He couldn't sleep. He was miserable. And he got up early the next morning, and he went in haste to the lion's den. And he came to the den, and he cried with a lamentable voice. He had said the night before, he said, well, Daniel, I'm sure your God will take care of you. Did he really believe that? Well, no. He couldn't imagine how something like that could really work. And so he worries all night, feels terrible about how stupid he was to sign this thing. Comes there with his lamentable voice, and he says, Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God, whom you serve continually, is he able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel immediately answered, said, yes, sir. My God sent his angel, and he shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't hurt me, because I was innocent to you and innocent to God. Well, the king was exceeding glad, and he commanded they bring Daniel up, and Daniel was taken out of the den, and he wasn't hurt at all, because he believed in his God. Now here we are, we started out, we saw Daniel as a young man, now we see him as an old man. Over 60, well, just figure from 604 to 539, you're looking at what, about 65 years that have passed. So if Daniel was, let's say, 15 or 16 at the beginning of the story, he's in his early 80s at this point. So we see Daniel as a young man, we see him as an old man. And what we see at this point Daniel believed in his God. You know, God was real to Daniel. Daniel was in far from ideal circumstances to serve God. Daniel's life had not taken the course or the direction that he would have imagined for himself. Not anything. Daniel didn't pick it out. Events happened that were beyond Daniel's ability to control. But you know the point, and I think, see, the personal level of lessons that you learn is Daniel found himself confronted by trials that he would have never chosen. But Daniel still tried to walk with God. He trusted God. He loved God. He prayed to God. He sought God. And God intervened at many times. Now, God didn't protect Daniel from everything that ever came up, but Daniel was protected in certain of these ways, and God used Daniel in a remarkable way. Used him to write part of the Bible, used him to lay out some of the most important prophetic overview of things. So Daniel is now brought up out of the lion's den. He's not hurt. Then the king says, okay, next, all you got. Daniel prayed to his God. That worked out pretty well. You guys going to pray to me. Well, let's see how well that'll work. We're going to throw you in. And brought them and their families, and we find that the lions had mastery of them, broke their bones in pieces before they ever got to the bottom of the den. Think about it from a lion's standpoint. Daniel gets thrown in, the lions see dinner. Normally these things are, for something like this, we're going to have the lions hungry, so you don't feed them right before, you want them hungry. Well, we're told that God sent an angel and closed the lion's mouth. Can you imagine, all night long this lion is looking over here at Daniel, and he can't get his mouth open, can't even roar. Angel just, has his mouth closed. The lion is right here. One thing I can guarantee you, by the time it got daylight the next morning, there were two things you could safely say about those lions. They were hungry and they were frustrated. They were hungry, hadn't been able to open their mouth, have a bite, and they watched dinner standing in front of them a whole night through, and they couldn't get over there to him. So they were hungry and they were frustrated, and that was the mood they were in when they threw the other guys in. Well, in the meantime, of course, the angels had left. They didn't have any reason to stick around. The angels left when Daniel did. And again, see, right here at the beginning of the Persian Empire, you find that God again testified that he is the great God, the supreme ruler. It's interesting that later on that as you look at how God brought things to the attention of the other successor empires. Very interesting. You realize that the Jews, during the tenure of Alexander the Great, a decree was made that exempted the Jews from paying taxes on the sabbatical year. The story is told in Josephus as Alexander was advancing with his army and came to Jerusalem. The high priest came out to meet him, to open the gates of Jerusalem. Well, the remarkable thing was the night before, Alexander had had a dream in which he had seen somebody that when he got to Jerusalem, this is who he saw, the high priest and all his vestments and everything come out, and he had had this dream. He had seen this man come to him the night before. And so he comes out. Well, Alexander's very impressed with that, and at that point the high priest opened up the book of Daniel, and he told Alexander that he would be successful in his endeavor, and showed him and said, this is written in our sacred books, and read him a portion of how that the horn of the he-goat from Greece would smash the Medes and the Persians. Well, he was really impressed, and of course I'm sure that the high priest was smart enough to know when to stop reading, because if you'd gone on down a few verses, you read a little more. But he told him, you'll be successful in this endeavor. And he was. And Alexander was very impressed with that, and gave favor to the Jews. So anyway, this point is clearly made to the one who rules, and we find that Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, which was probably about 2 years, and then in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, chapter 7, we have the story, see, that sort of goes through in story flow up to chapter 6. Chapter 7 goes back and picks up the story with a series of visions. And this vision was one that Daniel had, and it was in the first year of King Belshazzar. Daniel had a dream, and he saw in this dream, he saw this stormy sea, this stormy situation, and these four great beasts, great creatures, came up out of the sea, and they were all different from one another. The first one was like a lion, had eagle's wings. Then the second was like a bear, raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth, and he was to arise and devour much flesh. Then he saw a leopard coming up, and it had 4 wings and 4 heads, and dominion was given. Then he saw a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, strong exceedingly. It had great iron teeth, and devoured and broke in pieces. It was different than the others, and it also had 10 horns. And as he was looking at the horns, there came up among them another little horn. He could see that one. And 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And this little horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit. And so we find that 1,000 thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And judgment was set, and the books were opened. And Daniel saw all of this, and he saw in the night visions, verse 13, one like the Son of Man. Coming in the clouds of heaven, he came to the Ancient of Days. They brought him near before him. There was given unto him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, won't pass away. So Daniel has this vision, and it just so real, it leaves him, he's upset when it's over with. He doesn't know what it means. So then an angel comes and tells him the interpretation. He said, these great beasts, verse 17, which are 4, represent 4 kings, or kingdoms, as we're going to see, which shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. And he wanted particularly to know about the fourth beast. It was different than the others. Had iron teeth, and devoured and broken pieces, and had 10 horns coming up out of his head. And it had this little horn whose look was more stout than his fellows, verse 20. And that little horn made war against the saints and prevailed against them until the Ancient of Days came. And judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the saints possessed the kingdom. And he was told, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth, and it'll be different. Tread down the earth, break in pieces, and the 10 horns of this kingdom are 10 kings that will arise. Now let's stop and think. Daniel had already seen a progression of 4 kingdoms, right? They started with Nebuchadnezzar, went to Persia, Greece, Rome. And finally, in the final days, that vision came down to the latter days when the God of heaven set up a kingdom that would never be removed. All those kingdoms passed away. Now Daniel sees a different vision. It's different symbols. But again, we have 4 kingdoms, you see. Notice here the statement is made about the fourth beast, that verse 23, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth. 4 kingdoms. Now, this fourth kingdom continues down to what? Well, the God of heaven sets up a kingdom. And the kingdom, verse 27, dominions, greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. So we have a progression of 4 kingdoms down to the kingdom of God. So clearly then, Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, you have one of these. This represents one of the keys to understanding end time prophecy, to understanding the book of Revelation, is Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. When you line them up together, because each tells part of the story. It's very clear from Daniel 2 where the progression starts and where it ends. Now we find these descriptions. Well, the first kingdom, the head of gold, Babylon, how is that like a lion? Well, that was, just like gold is the most precious of the metals. Here's the lion, the king of beasts. Notice that the lion stood on his feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Well, if you go back to Daniel chapter 4, you know what happened with Nebuchadnezzar, that he that was part of the part of what was going to happen to to Nebuchadnezzar when he became like an animal, and then when it restored, he was there, and he lifted up his eyes, and his reason returned. He was given back, in effect, the heart of a man, and instead of acting like a wild animal. So Nebuchadnezzar, this lion represented the Babylonians, the bear. Persia was known for its ponderous size, the great armies, and the 3 ribs in its mouth, representing the kingdoms, the 3 major things that they swallowed up in terms of the 3 great empires that were swallowed up. You come down to the 4-headed leopard described here in Daniel chapter 7, the speed, the quickness of Alexander and his troops, and then this great, terrible creature, the Roman Empire, connected again with iron. But we find that there were 10 horns that came up, and then this little horn. And the little horn was different than the others. It was in some ways like them. It was a horn, but it will arise after them in the sense of behind them. As Daniel sees the horns, and then back behind them, he sees this little horn. That's the sense of it. And it was different. It was responsible for subduing the first 3. And verse 25, this little horn would speak great words against the Most High, wear out the saints of the Most High, think to change times and laws, and they'll be given into his hand for times, and a dividing of a time. And so, really what you're looking at, see what emerged out of the old Roman Empire. Well, the 10 horns can be traced from the fall of the Roman Empire on down. But there was a little horn. There was another king. There was, for all of the political kingdoms that came up, there was a little kingdom that came up. It was different. Its look was more stout than his fellows. It lasted in a way that they didn't. It was small in terms of territory. You're looking at the papacy. You're looking at the Vatican. That's the one that has. They're still there all this time. And they're the ones that spoke great swelling words against the Most High, launched persecutions and inquisitions against the saints, and think to change times and law. Well, who did that? Where did Christmas come from? Where did Easter come from? Where did Sunday come from? Well, you go back. Catholic Encyclopedia won't try to tell you that it comes out of the Bible. They'll tell you that they did it by their authority. And they were responsible for, so you have this story. Now, we don't have time to go into a lot more detail, but you can go back and review it in the Beast booklet. But these things set the stage that as we come beginning in chapter 7, we continue through this series of visions Daniel was given about end-time prophecy. There is a a gap, approximately 400 years or 450 years in terms of the Bible, when the last book was written to when the story starts. You know, from the let's say the book of Malachi until the birth of Christ is about 400 years. So that story is not, of those 400 years, is not left out. It's told by way of prophecy in the book of Daniel. You see, you read about the Babylonians, that was extant. Then you read about the Persians, you read about the Greeks, you read about the Romans, you read about the story, because even during that time when God was not sending prophets, the story had already been told. Now, there's some really interesting things we're going to look at in the closing part of the book of Daniel, and I've got study questions to give you now that we'll go over the rest of that next Bible study. So with that, we'll be, and I might just mention that you may want to, for background, to go back and reread the booklet on the Beast of Revelation, because it will, just by necessity of going through this, we'll have to go through it rather rapidly, but if you get the background on it, it'll help you put it together. So let's pass out the questions here for the next time.